The monitor screamed flat. 0247 hours. ICU room for 14. Sacred Heart Medical Center, Portland. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but underneath it was nothing, no heartbeat, just the long hollow wail of asystole. Danielle Ross had already hit the call button 3 times. The overhead crackled twice with static and nothing else. She was alone with a dying man and exactly 90 seconds before brain death became irreversible. She didn't wait for permission anymore. Permission was a luxury she'd learned to recognize as a synonym for watching people die. The sterile field was already open on the bedside tray. She'd prepped it 2 hours ago when the commander's breathing shifted from labor to desperate. Nitrile gloves snapped like gunshots in the silence. Her hands moved the way they always moved in crisis, not fast, but efficient. Efficient was faster than fast. Efficient was the difference between saving and losing. The 14-gauge needle felt like an old friend. Familiar weight. Familiar angle. Her fingers found the 5th intercostal space, midclavicular line, and she could feel the anatomical landmarks beneath her fingertips like reading braille. The needle advanced. 1 breath. 2. The resistance changed. She felt it in her palm before the monitor registered anything. 200 cc of blood drained into the syringe. Dark. Thick. The kind of blood that shouldn't have been in the pericardial sac. Blood that had been slowly crushing the heart like a fist closing. The monitor's wail dropped half an octave. A single blip. Then another. Come on, she whispered to the machine, to the man, to the universe that had taught her long ago that whispering was sometimes louder than shouting. Come on. The blips became a rhythm. Irregular at first, then finding their pattern. 40 beats per minute. 60, the blood pressure cuff hissed as it auto-cycled. 60 over 40. 75 over 50. Climbing. Climbing. By the time the first doctor stepped through the door, slow, irritated, interrupted from whatever task had seemed more important than a code blue, the commander's oxygen saturation had climbed to 92%. His color was returning. Real color, not the gray-white of a man whose heart had stopped beating. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, taking in the scene the way a man looks at a broken vase that's been glued back together by someone without permission. Step back from the patient, he said. Not a request. Not a question. Danielle was already removing her gloves. The ritual of them peeling away from her skin was practiced, smooth, unrushed. She'd learned long ago that urgency was a feeling, not a requirement. You could move with devastating precision at walking speed. You could be calm while drowning. She turned to face him. Flat eyes. The kind of flat that comes from having looked at things no one should have to see and then choosing to look at them again anyway. Cardiac tamponade, she said. 200 cubic centimeters blood from the pericardial sac. Sinus rhythm restored. Vitals stabilizing. Behind Sterling, 2 residents appeared in the hallway, rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the tile floor. They stopped when they saw her hands, not trembling, not shaking. Steady. The hands of someone who had done this before. Many times. With bullets flying. Sterling's jaw tightened. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the quick math of what he could say, what he could do. A nurse doesn't perform advanced procedures. A nurse doesn't make the calls. A nurse doesn't save patients who flatlined. But the monitor sang its steady beep beep beep, and the oxygen saturation held at 94%, and the blood pressure cuff read 98 over 63, not perfect, but alive. Definitively, undeniably alive. I'll need a full report on your actions, Sterling said finally. His voice was level, but underneath it was something else. Something like recognition, maybe, or the first spark of something that would grow into something much worse. Immediately. Danielle nodded once. Movement, not words. Economy of gesture. She'd learned that in 22 months of combat operations across the Helmand province, that silence could carry more authority than any explanation. Explanations were what people did when they felt the need to justify themselves. She hadn't justified anything since 2021. She turned back to the commander, checking the fall line, verifying the medication drip rate, her movements automatic and precise. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that constant white noise drone that made hospitals feel like the inside of a sleeping pill. The smell of antiseptic burned her nostrils, that sharp chemical bite she'd never gotten used to, the smell of sterility, of death being held at arm's length. Sterling was still in the doorway, watching. She could feel his presence the way you can feel pressure changes before a storm. The air had shifted. Something in the dynamic between them had changed at the moment the monitor stabilized. "Nurses don't perform pericardiocentesis," he said quietly. A statement, not quite a question. Danielle didn't turn around. She was checking the chest tube, listening to the liquid sound of drainage, counting the flow rate. "No, sir. You're out of your scope of practice." "Yes, sir." The patient was flat-lined. No cardiac output. Danielle adjusted the dressing with fingers that had held catheters steady in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter screaming through Taliban valleys. "That's correct, sir." Sterling left. She heard his footsteps go soft down the hallway, then harder, then gone altogether. But something had changed. She could taste it, that metallic flavor that came when dominance hierarchies shifted, when a person realized that the person they'd been treating as invisible might be invisible for a reason. Might be invisible because they'd learned how. The commander's breathing had steadied into a pattern that matched the ventilator. His chest rose and fell with mechanical precision. His chart noted his history in clinical shorthand, sucking chest wound from blast in March 2019. Medevac under fire. Surgeries, 7, days in country, 487. Commendations, classified. She'd known the moment she looked at him earlier tonight. Recognized him the way you recognize scars, by the shape they make, by the story the body tells. Commander James Hawthorne. 3 tours. The medic who took her position when she'd hung up her uniform and chose Portland, chose quiet, chose a life where she wasn't responsible for keeping people alive under impossible circumstances. Chose wrong, maybe. Because here he was, in a hospital bed, and here she was, doing the only thing she'd ever been good at. From the locker room, before the shift, she'd touched the challenge coin the way she did every night. Smooth metal worn soft by hands and time. The inscription was barely readable anymore, the 1st of January, 19. Marja. We were there. 14 people whose names were engraved on the back, too small to read without a magnifying glass, too important to ever forget. 3 of them were dead. 1 because of her decision. 1 because of bad luck. 1 because war didn't care about odds or merit or the fact that his daughter had just been born. And now the 4th had just come back from the edge, and she'd been the one to grab him. The monitor beeped steadily. The ventilator wheezed. Somewhere in the building, Sterling was picking up a phone, and she could feel it like pressure building in her chest. The moment had passed. The invisible nurse had done something impossible, and now the accounting would begin. Now the questions would start. Now the silence she'd cultivated for 2 years would crack like ice under weight. The next voice she heard wasn't human. It was an alarm. The overhead speaker crackled at 0847, Dr. Sterling's voice filling the entire ICU floor with practiced casualness. Can Nurse Nightingale report to the supply closet? Looks like we need someone to restock the bedpans. 3 nurses at the station froze. An intern smirked into his coffee. The nickname hung in the air like something toxic, spreading through the morning shift hand off the way poison moves through a bloodstream. Danielle didn't look up from her charting. Her jaw tightened, barely perceptible, a single muscle fiber tensing, but her hands remained steady on the keyboard. She logged out, stood, and walked toward the supply closet without acknowledging the ripple of discomfort she'd created simply by existing in a space where she wasn't supposed to speak unless spoken to. Sterling was waiting inside, blocking the doorway the way a predator blocks an exit. His face had that particular expression, the one he'd perfected over the past 3 weeks, ever since she'd corrected his dosage calculation in front of an intern. 1 milligram instead of 2. The difference between a therapeutic dose and a lethal one. The difference between alive and dead. He'd smiled when she'd said it, but that smile was a knife pretending to be kindness. Your inappropriate confidence is going to cost you this job, Ross. His finger jabbed toward her face, not quite touching, but close enough that she could see the wedding band catching fluorescent light. I've already spoken to Director Chen about your insubordination. You corrected me. In front of an intern. Do you know what that does to a physician's authority? Do you understand the hierarchy here? Danielle stared at him with eyes the color of storm clouds over the North Atlantic. She didn't blink. She didn't step back. She let the silence stretch, 1 full second, 2, 3, 4, 5, until the air between them felt like it was vibrating. You know what's interesting about cowards, Doctor? Her voice dropped half an octave, steady as a surgical laser. They always need an audience. She turned and walked past him, her shoulder not quite brushing his arm, and returned to the ICU floor while his mouth was still forming a response he'd never deliver. The station went quiet. Papers shuffled. Someone pretended to be very interested in their phone. But Sterling wasn't finished. He was never finished. That was the nature of men like him. They mistook silence for victory, and confusion for defeat. 20 minutes later, as Danielle was charting the morning medications, Sterling approached again, this time with nurse manager Patricia in tow. His voice carried across the station, loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough to make it official. The Nightingale nickname is affectionate, he said, smiling at Patricia as if sharing an inside joke. Though I suppose someone with your limited education might not appreciate literary references. He turned back to Danielle. Florence Nightingale? The lady with the lamp? Perhaps we should assign you a night shift, suits your skill level. Patricia looked uncomfortable but said nothing. That was the agreement, the unspoken contract between doctors and administrators. Silence was loyalty. Loyalty was job security. Danielle continued charting. She didn't respond. She didn't defend herself. She didn't allow Sterling the satisfaction of seeing her react. Instead, she filed the comment away the way soldiers file away insults, not forgotten, but catalogued with the precision of someone who knew that every small cruelty was a data point, every humiliation a piece of evidence. The morning shift ended at 1400. Danielle finished her charting, stripped off her gloves, and headed toward the employee parking lot. The day crew was arriving for the 1500 handoff, streaming through the main entrance in their fresh scrubs and their fresh optimism. Sterling was waiting in the parking lot. He held a manila folder the way a prosecutor holds evidence, carefully, ceremonially, with the weight of something predetermined. Reassignment to janitorial duties, effective immediately, he said, handing her the demotion notice in front of 8 incoming staff members. Their footsteps slowed. Their eyes drifted. Environmental Services needs competent people. You'll report to their supervisor at 2200 tonight. Clear your locker by end of shift. The parking lot air smelled like hot asphalt and diesel exhaust from the delivery trucks. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance, the kind of sound that never stops meaning something in a hospital town. Danielle took the paper. She read it completely while Sterling watched, his expression confident, his posture the posture of a man who'd won. She noted the date, the signature, the official hospital seal. She folded it precisely in half, then in half again, creating perfect geometric thirds. Is that all, Doctor? Her voice was ice. Not the ice of anger, that would have been human, would have been the response he wanted. This was the ice of something far colder. Clarity. Certainty. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst and knowing, with absolute confidence, that you will survive this too. She turned and walked to her 15-year-old Civic without waiting for an answer. Behind her, the whispers started immediately. Did you hear? Janitorial? After 6 years? He finally did it. Finally pushed her out. Someone should file a complaint, but nobody ever does, not against Sterling, not when he has the director in his pocket and 3 lawyers on speed dial. The Civic's interior was stifling. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, staring at the demotion notice on her passenger seat. Janitorial duties. It was brilliant, really, not a firing, which would trigger investigation and union involvement, but a demotion so humiliating that she'd either quit or her voice would disappear entirely. She'd become just another night shift janitor, invisible, replaceable, the kind of person doctors walked past without seeing. Her phone buzzed. Marcus. Her 16-year-old son, home from school, texting goodnight early because he had swim team later. She stared at the message, at his name on her screen, at the life she'd chosen when she'd left the service. Quiet. Normal. Safe. Just a nurse. Just a single mother trying to build something that didn't require weapons or backup or the knowledge that people wanted you dead. She sat there for 18 minutes. She could see the ICU windows from here, the 4th-floor units where patients who were supposed to die sometimes lived if the right person was paying attention at the right moment. Where she'd just saved the life of a commander who'd taken her exact position when she'd retired honorably from the Coast Guard 2 years ago. Where she'd felt something shift in her chest when she saw his name on the assignment board, not coincidence, not in military life, but something closer to destiny's reminder that the past was never really gone. She turned the key in the ignition. Home was 18 minutes away in good traffic. Instead, she drove straight to her apartment, pulled on fresh scrubs, and sat on her bed staring at nothing until 2:30 in the morning when her phone rang. Patricia's voice was tight, controlled, the voice of a manager trying not to panic. Danielle, I know you're off tomorrow but we're short-staffed. The commander in 414 is deteriorating. His breathing sounds wrong. Can you come in? Not a request. An emergency. The kind of call that transcended chains of command and shift schedules. Danielle was already moving. She hadn't undressed. She'd been waiting, though she wouldn't have known how to explain that if anyone had asked. She arrived at Sacred Heart at 0245 wearing last night's desperation like a second skin. The ICU was controlled chaos, the particular organized panic of a hospital that's already lost too many this shift and doesn't want to lose another. The commander's monitor was singing out alarms. Vitals crashing. Heart rate 34 and dropping. Blood pressure 62/40. His neck veins distended like purple cords straining against taut skin. Cardiac tamponade. Blood in the pericardial sac, compressing the heart, crushing it from the inside. Danielle paged the on-call cardiologist. No response. She paged surgery. No answer. She paged Sterling as the attending physician. He responded in 47 seconds, stabilize him. I'm 20 minutes out. 20 minutes. The monitor showed pulseless electrical activity. Flat line. No perfusion. A heart that had given up. Danielle opened the crash cart. She pulled out the pericardiocentesis kit with hands that did not shake because hands don't shake when muscle memory takes over, when 20 years of training overrides the chatter of fear. A night shift intern named Dr. Patel stood frozen, watching. You can't do that, Patel said. His voice had the particular brightness of someone enforcing a rule he'd memorized but didn't understand. That's a physician procedure. You're outside your scope of practice. Danielle was already prepping the site. The needle gleamed under the overhead lights like something both surgical and inevitable. Then get me a physician, she said quietly. And she inserted the needle into the pericardial space, felt the subtle shift as the needle found the sac, heard the hiss of air as she withdrew the plunger. 200 milliliters of blood flowed into the syringe. Thick. Dark. Containing everything the heart should have been pumping through vessels instead of pooling where it had no business being. The monitor changed. The flat line became a rhythm. Weak, irregular, but present. The rhythm that meant alive instead of dead. The monitor flatlined at 0247. Now it was 0300, and Commander Hayes was drowning in his own blood. Danielle had the needle positioned before the crash cart even arrived, 14-gauge angiocath, sterile technique, her hands moving with the kind of precision that only comes from muscle memory and combat medicine in a shot-up helicopter over Marja. The pericardial sac was a balloon filling with blood, crushing his heart from the outside, choking it. 40 seconds to decompress it or he was dead. The needle penetrated the skin. Dark blood, nearly black, flooded the syringe. 100 cc. 150. The rhythm came back before she hit 200. His blood pressure climbed from a ghost reading of 60/40 to something that meant alive. 250 cc of blood that had been suffocating his heart now filled the syringe, and his eyes, those eyes that had watched her back in a medevac bird over Taliban territory, fluttered open. Lieutenant Commander Ross. His voice was paper-thin, cracked from hypoxia. Stay still, Commander. You're safe now. The doors burst open at 0303. Dr. Sterling stood in the threshold, his phone already pressed to his ear, his face the color of old brick. The fluorescent lights caught the sweat on his forehead. His other hand was pointing at Danielle with the kind of trembling energy that came from a man watching his entire worldview shatter in real time. Get her away from that patient. Not a question. Not a request. Danielle's hands didn't shake. She set the syringe down on the sterile field with the kind of calm that made the young resident in the corner, some kid named Morrison who'd been standing useless by the monitors, physically step backward. She's performing a procedure without licensure, Sterling said into the phone, his voice rising. Practicing medicine. I have witnesses. I have documentation. Get me administration. Get me legal. Get me risk management. Now. Danielle stepped back from the bed, her gloves still dark with the commander's blood. She didn't remove her eye contact from Sterling's face. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The commander tried to sit up, his voice hoarse. She saved my life. She knew exactly. Sir, you're experiencing hypoxia-induced disorientation, Sterling said, cutting him off with the kind of clinical precision that would have sounded authoritative if his hands weren't shaking. This nurse performed an invasive procedure without authorization. Without a physician present. That's a felony in this state. Danielle spoke for the first time since Sterling entered the room. Dr. Patel was on the phone. The entire procedure was supervised. Sterling's eyes snapped to her. For a moment, something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe. The understanding that she knew exactly what she was doing, which meant something far worse than incompetence. It meant he couldn't explain this away as a nurse who'd panicked and overstepped. It meant she'd acted with authority. He turned back to his phone. I'm filing a formal complaint with the state licensing board. And I want her removed from this patient immediately. Get security if necessary. By 0400, Sterling had made his first 3 calls. To the Chief of Staff. To the hospital's legal counsel. To the risk management director, who, according to the message left on her voicemail, was experiencing a potential liability exposure of catastrophic proportions. By 0500, he'd made 6 more. Each one the same script, slightly varied. A nurse had performed an invasive cardiac procedure. A pericardiocentesis. Without physician authorization. Yes, the patient had stabilized. Yes, that was exactly the problem. Because now administration would have to explain how they were going to justify letting an RN commit a felony on their premises. Yes, he understood the patient owed his life to the procedure. Precisely. Which made it worse. Because now this nurse had created a liability exposure that cut both ways. If they punished her, they looked vindictive. If they didn't, they looked corrupt. The morning came cold and grey through the hospital windows. Rain hammered the glass like applause from an audience that would never know what had really happened in room for 14. Sterling moved through the corridors of Sacred Heart with a coffee cup in each hand, distributing them like sacraments. He found Dr. Ramirez near the imaging center. Coffee first. Then, heard about the incident in ICU. Nurse overstepping her scope. Dangerous precedent if we don't address it. State licensing board gets wind of this, we're liable for every complication that patient ever has, going forward. The hospital could face 6-figure fines. 7, even. Dr. Ramirez took the coffee. Signed the complaint by 0630. Dr. Hayes, no relation to the commander, near radiology. Coffee. The nurse who performed the procedure without supervision? Yeah. Creates a liability nightmare. If we don't formally document our disapproval, the state considers the institution complicit. You'd be signing off on a nurse practicing medicine. Legal says we have to push back. Hard. Signature by 0645. Dr. Patel, the one who'd actually supervised the procedure, who'd coached Danielle through every step, tried to push back. She performed a life-saving intervention. I was present. I authorized. You were on the phone. Sterling cut him off, his voice smooth as silk. Not physically present. Different legal standard. The hospital needs to show that we have protocols and that we enforce them equally. If we make an exception for nurses, what's next? Respiratory therapists starting 4s? Paramedics intubating in the ER. Dr. Patel's face hardened. But he signed anyway. Because the hospital's legal department had already called. Because his malpractice insurance carrier had suggested compliance. Because sometimes the right thing and the institutional thing weren't the same thing, and the institution always won. By 0800, Sterling had 12 signatures. 12 attending physicians. 12 people who owed him favors or feared the liability exposure more than they feared doing the wrong thing. Each signature represented another layer of institutional weight pressing down on Danielle Ross. Dr. Sterling wasn't just building a case against her. He was building a consensus. He was turning the entire medical staff into witnesses to his complaint. He was making her prosecution feel inevitable, institutional, unavoidable. The thing Sterling didn't understand, couldn't possibly understand, was that he was laying evidence of his own sabotage without even realizing it. He was documenting his campaign. He was creating a paper trail that showed exactly how calculated this was, exactly how little the actual medical outcome mattered to him, exactly how much this was about his authority being challenged by someone he'd already dismissed as just a nurse. A nurse who'd saved a man's life with her hands and her muscle memory and her refusal to watch someone die just because a doctor was too busy protecting his ego to do his job. At 1015, Danielle's pager went off. The message was brief, Director Chen's office. Now. She was still wearing the same scrubs from the code. The ones with the commander's blood dried on the cuffs. She didn't change. She didn't wash her hands beyond the minimum. She walked to the administrative floor the way she'd walked through Marja, shoulders level, eyes forward, carrying the weight of decisions that weren't supposed to be hers to make. Director Chen's office was on the 14th floor. The view showed Portland spread out below, grey and wet and indifferent to what was about to happen in this room. Danielle had already figured it out. The 12 signatures meant 12 testimonies. The 12 signatures meant she was about to be fired. The question was how politely it would happen. Sterling was waiting in the hallway outside Chen's office. He held a folder, thick, substantial, the kind of folder that had been built over weeks, not hours. He was pale but composed. He'd won. He just didn't know yet that he'd set in motion something that would end him. After you, he said, gesturing to the office door. The folder dropped on Director Chen's desk like a closing coffin. Sterling opened it with the precision of a prosecutor. Incident reports. Policy violations. Witness statements. 12 signatures of supporting physicians. Each page was a brick in the wall being built around Danielle's career. But it was the last page, the one at the bottom of the folder, that would matter later. A single document, dated 3 months ago, that Sterling had apparently forgotten to remove. A personnel record. A background check summary. One line, apparently insignificant in the blur of his campaign, that read, background, military service, 12 years, discharge code honorable. That page would be mentioned later. That page would change everything. Director Chen's office smelled like coffee gone cold and the faint antiseptic edge that never quite left Sacred Heart's air, no matter how many times the cleaning crew scrubbed. Danielle stood before the mahogany desk at 1,207 hours, rain still drying on her shoulders. Sterling sat in the corner with a file folder 2 inches thick, the kind of folder that takes weeks to assemble, the kind that speaks a language hospitals understand better than the truth. Chen didn't make eye contact. She slid a single document across the desk. 12 signatures. Danielle counted them without touching the paper. 12 attending physicians had signed a formal complaint alleging patient endangerment, unauthorized medical practice, violation of scope of practice. Each signature represented a phone call Sterling had made that morning. Each one a small betrayal purchased with coffee and carefully worded concerns about liability exposure. Ms. Ross, we're terminating your employment effective immediately, Chen said. Her voice had the practiced distance of someone who'd done this before, who'd been trained to deliver terminations the way surgeons deliver anesthesia, with clinical precision and emotional removal. Sterling opened his folder. The sound of paper sliding against manila was like a judge's gavel. I've been documenting concerns for weeks, he said, spreading documents across the desk like evidence at a crime scene. Late charting on April 3rd. Here's the incident report. Medication room irregularities on April 10th. Insubordination on April 15th when she questioned my clinical judgment in front of medical students. Each page was official. Stamped. Filed. Each one was also a lie dressed up in bureaucratic language, twisted facts folded into official forms, statements he'd coerced from staff using the weight of his title like a hammer. Danielle recognized the architecture of the execution. This was death by 1,000 forms. Not a single catastrophic blow but a slow paperwork funeral, each document another nail, the institution itself becoming the weapon. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing stayed steady. Pain is data, and the data told her everything she needed to know she'd already lost. Chen set down her pen. Do you have anything to say? Danielle looked at Sterling. His face carried the expression of a man who'd finally gotten what he wanted, not justice, but vindication. Not safety, but supremacy. Then she looked at Chen. The commander would be dead, Danielle said. Her voice came out flat and measured, the voice of someone stating a fact to a room full of people who'd chosen not to listen. His pericardium was filling with blood. 200 cubic centimeters in the span of 6 minutes. His blood pressure was 70/40. His O2 saturation was 68% and dropping. I had for minutes before his heart stopped pumping. For minutes. Sterling leaned forward. The commander would have been fine if you'd waited for an actual physician. You were 12 minutes away, Danielle said. She didn't raise her voice. That was the difference between them. He yelled when he had nothing left, she spoke quietly when she had everything to lose. He'd have been dead for 8 minutes by the time you arrived. Chen looked between them. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "You're dismissed." Danielle stood. The chair didn't scrape, she'd learned long ago how to move without making noise, how to exit rooms the way soldiers exit buildings, with intention and minimal disturbance. "May I clean out my locker?" Sterling insisted on escorting her personally. He carried his file folder like a trophy, the evidence of his victory, the documentation of her destruction. They walked through Sacred Heart's corridors in silence, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead with their thin electric hum, the ventilators wheeling in the distance, the occasional code blue announcement drifting through the speakers. The hospital's heartbeat, continuing without her. Her locker was in the basement staff room, a 6x12 metal box that had held her life for the last 2 years. She opened it slowly. Inside was everything that mattered and nothing that was enough. A cracked mug reading "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, a gift from the ICU team at the end of her first month. A dying succulent in a ceramic pot, the kind Marcus had insisted on buying her at the farmer's market 3 weeks ago, his hand stained green as he tried to talk her into believing plants could grow anywhere. The photograph from Kandahar, the one she never showed anyone. Her team. 12 operators in desert camo, standing in front of a medevac halo with the Hindu Kush mountains blue and sharp behind them. 3 faces circled in black marker. Kia. Killed in action. Dead for 4 years and still dead in her pocket every single day. She wrapped everything into a cardboard box. It was the kind of box that had come with printer paper, the kind that had zero dignity, zero weight. Sterling watched from the doorway, his expression like a wolf that had finally run down prey. The commander appeared in the hallway in a wheelchair. His skin still had the grey-white pallor of someone who'd spent 72 hours in an ICU, whose body was still calculating survival. An older man in a dark suit stood beside him, the commander's SEAL liaison, a man with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, with eyes that had the flat operator's stare of someone who'd seen every version of human capacity for both cruelty and courage. The commander pushed himself forward with both hands, movements deliberate and careful. He pressed something into Danielle's palm. Cold. Metal. The tarnished military challenge coin, the one his unit had given her in Marja, the one she'd kept through every deployment after, the one that had sat in a jewelry box in her apartment while she tried to forget who she'd been before she decided to just be a nurse. Sterling moved to block the commander's path. "Sir, you need to return to your room." The man in the suit stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Step back, Doctor." Sterling opened his mouth. "I said step back." It wasn't a request. It was a command structured in the exact acoustic frequency of a man accustomed to having his orders followed. Sterling stepped back. The science of authority, the physics of presence, some people carried weight just by existing in a room, and the SEAL carried it like gravity. Danielle walked toward the exit. She didn't look back. She'd learned that looking back just gave people permission to follow. Rain hammered the Portland parking lot like applause for a performance no one wanted to see. The weather had turned vicious in the time she'd been inside, summer rain, the kind that fell hard and angry, that soaked through scrubs in seconds and turned the asphalt into mirrors of reflected light. She sat at the bus stop bench, the cardboard box on her lap, rain soaking through the cardboard in dark spreading stains, dripping from her hair in small rivers. The challenge coin was wrapped in a paper towel. She unwrapped it slowly, letting the wet paper peel away. The unit insignia was still visible beneath the tarnish, the Coast Guard emblem, and below it the call sign her team had given her. A name she hadn't spoken out loud in 24 months. The rain hammered down around her, and she held the coin between her palms like it was something that could warm her, something that could reverse the last 2 years, something that could turn her back into the person she'd been before she decided that saving lives was more noble than taking the medal and leaving. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling had won. Not because he was better, not because his complaint had merit, but because the system itself rewarded people like him. The system protected doctors who yelled, who built institutional consensus, who understood that you could destroy a person as long as you filed the paperwork correctly. The system had 12 physicians to prove it. She sat in the rain and didn't move. The box was falling apart. The succulent would be dead by morning. The photograph would be ruined. All she had left was the challenge coin and the understanding that somewhere inside Sacred Heart, Dr. Sterling was walking back to his office, his file folder closed, his victory complete, his understanding of how the world worked confirmed one more time. The rain kept falling. The rain hadn't stopped. It hammered the parking lot like applause that wouldn't end, and Danielle sat on the plastic bus bench with her cardboard box when she heard the sound of running footsteps splashing through puddles. Marcus! Her 16-year-old son was soaked completely through, his clothes clinging like wet leaves, his breathing ragged like he'd run the entire distance from Lincoln High. He was carrying something in both hands, a shadow box. Medals. Real ones, mounted on felt the color of old blood. Mom. He wasn't asking permission. He was stating a fact. They need to see these. You can't just let him win. Danielle looked at her son's face and saw the same jaw she saw in the mirror every morning, the same eyes that had watched her pack a duffel bag and leave for Kandahar when he was 14. The same eyes that had learned to hold rage steady instead of spilling it everywhere like a broken vessel. "Marcus, no," she said quietly. "Put those away. He destroyed you. He lied to every doctor in that hospital. You saved a man's life and he—" Marcus stopped. He was already moving towards Sacred Heart's sliding doors before she could finish her sentence. She could follow or sit on a bench holding a dying succulent and a photograph of people who were mostly dead. She stood up. The box stayed behind on the bench seat. They walked into Sacred Heart at 1420 hours. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and defeat. Marcus didn't hesitate. He knew exactly where he was going, up the back stairwell, past the administrative offices, toward the executive floor where decisions got made by people who'd never held a stethoscope or performed a procedure or watched someone stop breathing at 3 in the morning. Director Chen's conference room was already full. Chen herself sat at the head of a glass table like a captain who'd steered her ship into shallow water. 3 other department heads. HR. A security officer positioned by the door like a statement. Marcus stood in the doorway, dripping water onto the carpet, holding the shadow box like an artifact from a tomb. "My mother is Lieutenant Commander Danielle Ross, Coast Guard Special Operations," he said, and his voice didn't crack even once. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. The HR director, a woman named Summers with trembling hands, pulled up a laptop. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the speed of someone who suddenly understood they'd made a catastrophic error. A file opened. Then another. Documents started appearing on the screen. Service record. Discharge papers. Medical certifications. Danielle stood behind her son and didn't move her face, didn't let anything show except the absolute certainty of someone who'd already survived the worst and simply refused to perform shock for an audience. Director Chen stood. "Lieutenant Commander Ross." "I don't," Danielle said. One word. 10 years of authority compressed into a single syllable. The conference room doors opened again. A wheelchair emerged, pushed by a SEAL whose call sign was Breaker and whose presence made the air pressure change like a storm was moving inland. The commander in the chair had color in his face for the first time in 3 days. His left arm was strapped to his chest, but his eyes were clear. Alert. The eyes of a man who understood exactly what was happening in this room and had driven himself across Portland to make sure it happened correctly. Breaker stood at the commander's shoulder and spoke with the precision of someone who'd spent 20 years giving briefings to Pentagon officers. Lieutenant Commander Danielle Ross served 3 tours in Kandahar and Helmand Province with Coast Guard Special Operations. She holds a Bronze Star with Valor for emergency thoracotomy performed in a CH-53K under fire. 2 Purple Hearts. And she's currently being processed for a Navy Cross recommendation based on medevac operations under fire at COP Marja in March 2011. Chen sank back into her chair like someone had removed her spine. The pericardiocentesis she performed on this patient 3 days ago was by medical definition textbook, Breaker continued. She drew 200 cubic centimeters of blood from a pericardial sac that was compressing a heart that had stopped beating. She did this in the dark with no ultrasound guidance because that's what combat medical training teaches you, or work with what you have. The patient woke up because of her. He's sitting in this room because of her? Every attending physician in this hospital would have waited for specialists to arrive. Every single one. The doors opened again. FBI agent Morrison walked through like law enforcement had suddenly decided this conversation was important enough to interrupt. He was carrying 2 file folders, and his face had the expression of a man who'd spent 3 months looking at computer records and federal crimes and suddenly developed a very accurate understanding of institutional fraud. "Dr. Sterling," Morrison said, and Sterling wasn't in the room to hear it, but Morrison continued anyway. "We've been investigating healthcare fraud at Sacred Heart for 3 months. Altering patient files. Backdating incident reports. Fabricating documentation. Creating a false pattern of negligence against Nurse Ross to provide justification for termination. Our Summers looked like someone was explaining that her body had been replaced with glass. We have access logs from the hospital's nursing station computers, Morrison said. Sterling modified patient charts on April 3, April 10, and April 15, the exact dates of his incident reports against Ms. Ross. We have security footage of him at the station at 0200 hours. We have his computer authentication timestamps on 37 different patient files. We have statements from nursing staff who observed him manipulating colleagues to sign statements they didn't verify. The second door opened. 2 additional agents entered and positioned themselves with the kind of casual certainty that meant backup had arrived. We're prepared to arrest Dr. Sterling for federal healthcare fraud, filing false documentation with federal agencies, and conspiracy, Morrison said. That's 5 to 15 years per count. His medical license is suspended pending review. His certifications are revoked as of this morning. Director Chen's hands were shaking now. She was clicking through files on her laptop with the look of someone who suddenly understood that the hospital's chief of medicine was not a doctor but a federal criminal case number. The commander wheeled himself forward. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made sounds like water dripping and shoes shifting register as enormous. I owe my life to that woman, he said, and his eyes found Danielle's. She trained under fire at Marja. She trained me. Her hands kept my heart beating when it had stopped. And every person in this room understood immediately that she was the most competent medical professional present when I flatlined. Breaker stepped forward. She's been processed for Navy Cross. That's not standard. That's extraordinary. 12 doctors in this hospital signed a complaint to cover for their own failure. 12 cowards who didn't move when a patient crashed because they were waiting for hierarchy instead of trusting expertise. He paused. She would have saved him anyway. Even if you'd all fought her. Even if you'd been screaming. Her muscle memory would have overridden every institutional framework you're hiding behind. The room didn't feel like a conference room anymore. It felt like a tribunal. Danielle could smell Sterling's cologne in the carpet from where he'd walked this hallway victorious 48 hours ago. She could see the exact spot where his confidence had been absolute. Morrison's radio crackled. He answered it, listened, then looked at Director Chen. We're moving on the arrest. He's in his office. Do you want to let him come here voluntarily, or do you want officers walking through your hallway in a perp walk? Chen didn't answer. She stood and walked toward the door. The security officer moved aside. 20 minutes later, Sterling came through those same doors in handcuffs. He was still wearing his white coat. His face had the expression of someone who'd suddenly understood that the world operated on different rules than he'd believed, and those rules had turned out to be unfathomable and absolute. His eyes found Danielle's face. She stared back without blinking, without softening, with the absolute neutrality of someone who'd already moved on to the next thing. She corrected me, Sterling said, and his voice was cracking now like someone had fractured his spine. In front of an intern. She was just a nurse and she. Breaker stood. His movement was casual. His presence was not. Lieutenant Commander Ross has more combat medical experience than every physician in this room combined. She's performed procedures under fire that would make your hospital training look like summer camp. You didn't destroy her because she embarrassed you. You destroyed her because you can't handle existing in a room with someone who outmatches you. Sterling was led out of the conference room by FBI agents. As they passed Danielle, he tried to catch her eye again. She touched the challenge coin in her scrub pocket, felt its tarnished weight, and turned away before his handcuffs cleared the doorway. The message was perfectly clear: you're no longer significant enough to hold my attention. 6 months passed. The rain dried. Sterling's court date arrived and departed with a plea deal, 5 years federal minimum, loss of medical license, community service, and a night shift security position at Sacred Heart itself. The hospital's board decided that rehabilitation required visible proof of humility. Visible meant Sterling mopping the hallways at 0230 hours in a security guard uniform that hung on him like a costume from a child's play. Danielle returned to the ICU on a Tuesday in October. The night shift welcomed her back like she'd never left. Director Chen had personally reinstated her with back pay and a formal apology. 3 of the 12 doctors who signed Sterling's complaint had written private letters of regret. The other 9 had learned to make eye contact with doorways instead of her face. Dr. Patel, the intern who'd watched everything unfold, now asked Danielle to review his critical care cases. Marcus came to the hospital after school sometimes, sat in the break room doing homework, and didn't hide the way he told people that his mother was a decorated combat medic with a Navy Cross under review. At 0230 on a Thursday, Danielle was charting vital signs in room for 14 when she saw someone moving through the hallway with a mop. The night security guard uniform swam on his frame like water. It took her 3 seconds to recognize him. Sterling. His face had hollowed. His hair had started to gray at the temples. He was mopping the section of floor right outside the ICU, and his hands were moving in the mechanical rhythm of someone who understood exactly how many more years of this he had remaining. He looked up and saw her. His mop froze mid-stroke. Danielle reached into her scrub pocket and touched the challenge coin. She felt its tarnished edges, the same coin the commander had pressed into her palm when she'd saved his life in Marja. The same coin his unit had given her on a tarmac with dust still settling. She held it for just a moment, long enough to remember Kandahar, the medic she'd trained, the choice she'd made to walk away from that life. She remembered the supply closet, the nickname that had spread like poison, the rain at the bus stop, the cardboard box, her son running through puddles. Sterling's mouth opened like he might speak. Like he might explain or apologize or ask for forgiveness or request some kind of recognition that he understood now what she actually was. Danielle walked past him without a word. Her shoes were silent on his freshly mopped floor. She moved toward room for 14 where a new patient was waiting for vitals to be checked, a teenager with pneumonia, a kid who would probably survive because someone in this hospital actually knew how to recognize when lungs were filling. Behind her, Sterling returned to mopping. The sound of water and antiseptic filled the empty hallway, a sound like the world cleaning itself. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If this story showed you something about hidden strength and quiet authority, about people who carry certifications instead of titles, subscribe to this channel. If you believe that honor means something, click like. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual capabilities, leave a comment telling us about it. Because the world needs to hear those stories too.